Time to take a quick look ahead to this weekend's massive crunch rematch between Katie Taylor and Delfine Persoon. So it's this Saturday night in Fight Camp. They've been in the bubble and they're ready to rematch in Eddie Hearn's backyard in Essex. Big rematch. The first fight, of course, took place last year. Katie Taylor won, but it's fair to say it was a controversial decision. And joining us to look ahead to this weekend's rematch is our very own Ronan Mullen from OTB Sports. Ronan, thanks for taking the call. I know this is a big one for you this weekend, but there must be a little bit of pressure on Katie coming into this fight, given the circumstances in which she won last time out, and the pressure of winning a fight when so many pundits and people are saying, no, actually, you didn't win the fight.
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned that first fight, the circumstances around it, obviously Madison Square Garden, all that comes with that, huge crowd. And that was just the fight before Anthony Joshua fought Andy Ruiz, and we all know what happened there. Joshua got his clock cleaned by Andy Ruiz, and that was a huge upset. And he had the same sort of mentality that I think Katie has going into his rematch with Ruiz, but he was obviously the loser that night. He had a point to prove. He went and did that. Whereas Katie, as you mentioned, actually won the night. She was given the judge's verdict. But you could just tell by her demeanour, although happy and pleased, obviously, to get the decision and make history, really, as the first undisputed lightweight champion from this part of the world. You could just, as I said, tell by her demeanour that she wasn't fully satisfied. And were it not for a couple of moving circumstances, Amanda Serrano falling out of this proposed date, we might never have seen this rematch, or definitely not so soon. So it's actually a nice happenstance for her that she's going to get a chance to right this wrong on Saturday.
I listened to Delphine Persoon's press conference yesterday, and she was talking about, we didn't think Katie Taylor would grant this rematch, and we were very surprised that it's a bit of a risk on her behalf to take this rematch. Were you surprised that she took it, or was it always an inevitability that they would go again?
There was a lot of, yourself, Shane, boxing history, there was a lot of posturing and back and forth between fighters over these kind of things. I don't think fighters themselves ever fear each other. I think there might be their teams maybe guiding them in certain directions. And Katie obviously went and did her own thing after that Persoon fight. The Amanda Serrano thing was long on the radar for Team Taylor, and the circumstances meant that negotiations were already at play probably before that Persoon fight happened. And then in November, she moved up to light welterweight, won a title there. So she had her own plans in place. But I think at the back of her mind, maybe not quite her team, I think the Persoon fight was probably the one she wanted to jump straight back into. And although it was a very difficult fight for her to navigate, we've all seen it, and it was a lot of trenched warfare at times, I think she will be keen to set the record straight. So from a Taylor perspective, I think she's happy enough to right that wrong. Maybe her team would have a little bit of scepticism, or nerves rather, over what could happen on Saturday.
Who's the pressure on more here? Because Katie's clearly going for a 16th straight win. She's had an extraordinary start to her professional career. And from Persoon's perspective, I mean, it's a revenge mission and a point to prove, really, given the result the last day out when she performed quite well but didn't get the result. I think 2 of the 3 judges went for Katie. But who's the pressure on more here?
It feels like a little bit of a shot to nothing for Persoon. I know she came in at late notice, as we touched on there. But even the first fight going in, Katie had fought several unifications against fellow champions and won them all quite easily. So I think the presumption before New York was that Persoon, long-standing champion, though she is, Taylor's superior skill set will just shine through here and get the job done. But that wasn't the case. And the only concern you'd have for Persoon is that she threw the kitchen sink at Taylor, produced a very good performance, and still didn't do enough to win out on the judges' scorecards. That's not exactly going to be helped by the fact that she's fighting in her opponent's literal back garden, or that of her promoter, at least, Eddie Hearn's Fight Camp. But I think, given the scepticism or the sort of attention that was on the scorecards the first time, I think the judges will be well aware that there will be similar levels on these. So Katie will be keen to put on a conclusive display. And I think if she sticks to her skills and boxes and moves, as has been pointed out by the likes of Kenneth Egan on this show and Andy Lee in months past, Katie obviously has superior skills. She showcased that in the amateurs. And if she can employ those to a greater degree than she did, I think this should be an easy night for her, easier at least. But you just wonder, and she actually alluded to this in conversations during the week, that she does get bought into the emotion of the crowd a little bit, and she does like to put on a show, and she's aware that she's an ambassador for women's boxing. Her tidal wave sort of brings the sport along, and if she's just going out there and being a bit of a clinician and winning rounds quite easily, it's not going to do much for the brand, where it's as if she almost had an onus on herself to put on a show in these fights. with the absence of a crowd and given how surreal the atmosphere is going to be, I think she'd be a lot more inclined to just get in there and be the old technical Katie Taylor, jab and move, land strongly. And you just never know, like, if she can land cleanly and consistently, you just don't know how this fight could go. This could be a very conclusive win for Katie Taylor. Persoon, on the other hand, will be presuming, I don't think she can fight any other way. Like, she made the point during the week that she can box too, and it's fair to say she can. She has reverted to more tactical skills in previous fights, but to try and do that against Katie Taylor would be a bit of a non-starter in my opinion. So Persoon has to do what she did last year, just better. And Katie has to maybe change her tactics up a little bit. It should make for a very intriguing fight, I think.
That's an interesting one on the crowd because, like, I was trying to think of a comparison, and you know me, Ronan, I'm going to bring things back to snooker if I possibly can. So, Ronnie O'Sullivan, someone who the pressure is always on, the crowd is always on his side, and clearly in the last 3 weeks he's performed at the Crucible in front of an empty crowd and won the World Championship. And coming into this fight, I was thinking, you know, Katie Taylor won't have the crowd support that she usually has. But it's an interesting point that you're making there, that maybe the pressure is always on her with the crowd, that maybe she can just focus less on the emotions of the occasion and more on her style and her combinations and what she needs to do to win.
Yeah, and it's the very nature of amateur boxing as well, which again she's so used to, that these very high level, high profile, huge stakes fights for medals at big competitions are fought just by dint of the fact that they're in sort of remote territories, that they're almost fought in front of small crowds. So she's well used to this sort of atmosphere, I think. And you think it would play into her hands. She is a bit of a show person. I think it could play into her that she might be a little bit, it might take something to get up for this if it were any other opponent. But I just think given the sort of angst she presumably had around what went with the Persoon fight and the aftermath of it, and plus the contention that you mentioned from observers at ringside and beyond, that maybe she didn't get the job done that night, I think she'll have enough of a point to prove that she probably won't need the crowd. And I think, as I said, I think it actually might be a benefit, because Katie has a tendency, which is actually, you can kind of merit her for it, that when she gets caught, she likes to land two back. But I think she'll be able to hear her coach's instructions very clearly. And again, she'll have that frame of reference in her mind that, you know, I'm here to get a job done here. And there's bigger nights to come. As big as this is, you know, there's huge crossover potential. There's unification fights. There's fights in other divisions on the horizon. So this is all about getting the W on Saturday.
It's been well publicised as a result of COVID-19. The fighters are all in this fighters bubble. They're in the Essex Holiday Inn, if you want to call it that. So clearly they're in close proximity to each other. Has there been much interaction between fighters that you've noticed? Is it all a PR marketing stunt that they're close together and there's all these videos and pre-fight smack talk, I guess? But are these two fighters that don't like each other? Has there been much interaction in the build-up?
There hasn't been a whole lot. There was a very funny clip you might have seen on the Matchroom social accounts where Taylor's sort of walking into the bubble, Persoon's just sitting there and staring her out, and Katie just walks right past her. So that kind of speaks to the icy relationship. I don't think there's necessarily disrespect, although Persoon might have said some unsavory things about Katie's style, and vice versa. Katie's fired her own shots back about Persoon's lack of tactical acumen. But I think on a personal level, it's just kind of an icy professional sort of rivalry. But once it's all said and done, I think they'll be happy enough to shake hands. But it's funny, in previous fight camps through the last few weeks, you've seen opponents and fighters mingling freely, and it's almost as if the stakes weren't quite as high. They'll probably disagree with that, but the fact that they were it was a little bit more camaraderie, I would have said. But you can see from the Taylor-Persoon fight, they want to be kept apart. And if you've been to a Holiday Inn, Shane, you know those hallways are pretty narrow. You know, it's probably, you're going to walk past each other in the hallway. One of you's going to have to stand to one side to let the other pass. So it's I hope there are other sides of the building. We don't have to worry about that in the heavyweight side of things, because you might have seen Dillian Whyte has rented 2 Winnebagos and sort of bolted them onto the side of the Holiday Inn, and that's where he's residing. Because I really do concern if him and Alexander Povetkin walk by each other in the Holiday Inn, things could get a bit feisty before Saturday.
Yeah, having been in the Holiday Inn halls, they're definitely not 2 meters in width anyway, for sure. Just before we get to that heavyweight encounter, you mentioned Dillian Whyte and Povetkin. A prediction, I think, and I saw Andy Lee during the week. I think he said Katie by 7 rounds to 3. But what's your what way are you calling this one on Saturday night?
I know you have a bit of a penchant for boxing history, Shane. I know you've spoken to some big historical figures from the world of boxing, and there's a very famous fight. I think we're into the 40-year anniversary. Sugar Ray Leonard against Roberto Duran. And the first fight, although Leonard lost, He fell into Duran's fight a little bit. They ended up having a bit of a scrap. Duran got inside his head a little bit and managed to get the job done in the first fight. For the second fight, Leonard reverted to type, outboxed Duran, and that brought about this famous no mass incident where Duran basically quit. And I honestly think if Taylor's landing consistently and relentlessly through this fight, she's got stoppages in these kind of fights before where she kind of uses her opponent's front foot aggression against them. And I think if Persoon's just consistently walking onto big shots from Taylor, I could feasibly see a late stoppage for Taylor. I think the smart money is probably on what Andy said, a sort of a wide unanimous decision for Taylor. But I wouldn't be surprised if she actually pulled out a late stoppage in this one.
It's an interesting one because she's not normally known as a knockout artist, but you've called it. You've heard it here first. Ronan Mullen going with Katie and stoppage. We get to the heavyweight bout then briefly. So Dillian Whyte against Alexander Povetkin. A lot of people have followed Dillian Whyte's career, quite an interesting career path, and he had that disappointing defeat to Anthony Joshua 5 years ago, and since then he's come on leaps and bounds. I think he said in the press conference today he's in the shape of his life, and when he's in the shape of his life, he just doesn't care. Is he in the shape of his life, and is this fight against Alexander Povetkin on Saturday night his to lose?
I think it is, just on the basis that Povetkin's probably seen his best days, but he's a very live opponent, and probably on paper, given where he and Joshua were at their relative points in 2015, Povetkin might be the toughest opponent of Whyte's career. It's open for debate, but just on the shape point, I saw Eddie Hearn was almost struck by Whyte's physique because they haven't obviously seen each other since pre-lockdown, and Whyte has spent the last 5 months in Portugal in training camp, and he actually looks in incredible condition. Like, I know a lot's made of maybe heavyweight boxers can be too muscle bound at times, and I actually quite like the way how loose Whyte was with his old frame. But I think what he's done is just basically trimmed up a little bit, and that can only add to his repertoire of skills because he's quite a high twitch fighter, got a great left hook, and I think that's the shot he's going to be looking for this weekend. Povetkin, on the other hand, has dynamite right hand, so I think whatever about fearing a stoppage in Taylor against Persoon, Shane, I think you can put your money on fairly confidently on a stoppage in the heavyweight fight.
Yeah, you mentioned those fierce hits of Povetkin's. I mean, a lot of people are boiling this down to his last chance. Does that make him a dangerous fighter, or does that make him a little bit more vulnerable given what's at stake?
We've seen Povetkin he's been on the scene for a long time, obviously Olympic champion and all that goes with that. That speaks to a superb boxing pedigree, but he entered the boxing fray at a pretty bad time given Vladimir Klitschko had basically full control of the reins with the big heavyweights. And then basically as Povetkin was sort of getting into the latter years of his career, the emergence of Tyson Fury came, the emergence of Anthony Joshua. So he never quite got to reign as a heavyweight king, but he's always in there. He's always a live opponent, as I said. And even when he fought Joshua a couple of years ago, he gave him a pretty good run for his money. He landed some big shots, and at times Joshua was in trouble. Joshua managed to close the show in the latter end of that fight. I think Whyte will have to navigate some pretty choppy waters in this one too. Povetkin's going to be dangerous in the early going, especially. And, he's got, on his record would suggest that he's got good endurance as well. 40 years old though he may be, I think Povetkin is savvy enough to navigate his way and maybe take Whyte into deep waters. But Whyte's so accomplished, Shane. He was on our show a couple of days after he boxed Joseph Parker. I think that was 2 years ago. And Joseph Parker was just one name on this really impressive resume that Whyte has put together since he boxed Joshua in 2015. And he's been WBC #1 contender for over 1,000 days, which just speaks to maybe the ridiculous boxing politics that can sometimes get in the way. But should he beat Povetkin in a fight that he doesn't actually have to take, he could just sit here and wait for Fury and Wilder to do their thing, and he's guaranteed to fight the winner, come what may. But he's taken a very dangerous fight basically to keep busy. And you'd have to say, with this fight, the profile that it is, plus Taylor Persoon and all that goes with that from an Irish perspective, and has captured the imagination, broadly speaking, too. This is definitely the biggest boxing card since March when all the COVID restrictions kicked in. So it's great to see big-time boxing back, and I'm expecting 2 very good fights there in the weird matchroom bubble in Essex.
Yeah, I think that says it all about the current state of play in the heavyweight division when you have a WC's #1 contender waiting 1,000 days without a world title fight. You expect that to happen next, I guess. I think he is expected to fight the winner of Fury and Wilder's trilogy fight, and isn't that confirmed?
There's been a lot of posturing around it. Eddie Hearn's in this uncomfortable position where he represents both Whyte and Joshua. So Joshua's obviously looking to belt to become undisputed champion in the heavyweight division, but Dillian Whyte's daily banging on Eddie Hearn's door saying, what about my shot? What about my shot? So I think the agreement is that Whyte will fight the winner of Fury and Wilder, but what the contention there is, we're not sure when Fury and Wilder are going to fight. Obviously, the huge gate has been taken off the table with those COVID restrictions, so the big money that they brought into Los Angeles and Las Vegas in the first two fights mightn't be available for the third. We're not even sure what Deontay Wilder's going to do. Like, you'll remember the fallout from that Fury fight. He took a pretty big pasting in that fight and has been quite quiet since he claimed or blamed his heavy costume for the defeat. So I think he's been lying low. We're not sure when Wilder's going to return, but I think by February, Dillian Whyte will, like, one way or another, be fighting for the world title should he win on Saturday. And again, it's worth pointing that out, that he's putting all his marbles on the line this weekend, just as like a creditable way to keep busy. But there's ways to keep busy, and then there's Alexander Povetkin. I think if I was trying to have a takeover, I might pick somebody else, but credit to him, he's never ducked difficult fights, and he's delivered every time he's been on pay-per-view. He's delivered action there. Oscar Rivas, and this one should be a cracker as well.
So how are you calling it? Who's going to win, and by what method?
I think you have to go Dillian Whyte. You have to go with the form man. I think he'll probably get that left hook away and end matters with that.
Okay, so Dillian Whyte's left hook and Katie Taylor by stoppage. You heard it here first. But Ronan Mullen, thanks very much as always for your boxing insight. And listen, enjoy the action tomorrow night.
Thanks a million, Shane.
OTB AM.
We'll get there eventually, Ger. This happened yesterday, I think, with Owen.
It did, yeah. It's not the first time this week. I'm new here. It's 9:30. It's an unbelievably busy weekend of sport with the boxing sandwich in the middle as well.